Our focus is on gender issues and how the gender stories should be covered, how we can have conversations around them without offending victims of sexual violence. We are also looking at the media in depth. How do we generate content? How do we balance between the expectation of the audience, regulation matters, and ethical issues as well? What training is required before one goes on air? We're now joined in studio by Felister Gitonga, who's the Program Officer and Harmful Practices Equality Now. Welcome to the show, Felister.
Thank you very much, Julia.
It's so nice to see you this year. So Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too.
At the end of March.
I know.
But Felister, let's talk about this. I know it's a whole range of issues. We can never comprehensively cover gender issues, and we have these shows regularly.
Yeah.
But let's talk about this particular incident that happened. And I'd just like to get your thoughts on the action that was taken, getting them off air. First of all, they were suspended, and then their contracts were terminated for what the management, of course, said was insensitive talk on gender issues. What's your take?
All right. So for me, I really agree with the termination of their contract, because I think what happened during that session was deplorable, and it shouldn't be repeated anywhere else in any media station. And also, but when I look at it, I'm also concerned, because I didn't feel like really their removal from their role was just for this. It's because there were high yield investors who actually took sides with the woman, and therefore led to the media houses looking at it in terms of what would be the cost of losing these advertisers. And then they decided to, of course, now remove them, because now that would have cost them more. But also I'm very impressed, because it just started like a social media campaign with young women and men who are progressive, charging and saying this is not okay, and even proceeding to call out advertisers who work with this specific radio station and asking them, really, do you want your product to be associated with this kind of remarks? And from there, the action that we have seen actually has shown that we are not helpless as a people. We can address certain issues that affect women, and by calling out that kind of behavior and calling it out with the kind of rage that I saw on social media.
The interesting thing is that when we were talking with David McCulley earlier, he talked about, we mentioned the issue of the role of advertisers, because we know that this took a turn when, like you said, high-stake investors also waded into this conversation. But David is of the opinion that really advertisers should not, control the editorial policy of an organization, that doing so is tantamount to saying that they're calling the shots, like, because we are giving this amount of money, we are paying this amount of money, we want programs done in this way. So where do you draw the line between that, appeasing your advertisers, of course, and of course maintaining control, editorial control?
In my opinion, I don't think actually the advertisers informed what the radio should do. They just barely took a stand that is informed by their values.
A stand that's worth tens of millions of shillings.
Yes. They took a stand in line with their values. And therefore, then at this moment, it was like the radio station now was in conflict with these values that these advertisers hold. Therefore, that was the consequence. I don't think the advertisers actually said this is how you should. They just said we do not want our brand and our product to be associated with this kind of remarks. And I think that's totally different, and I think it's proper to take a stand. And this is not just a Kenyan phenomenon. We have seen it all over the world, even with the US, the issue of Donald Trump, the issue of Black Lives Matter. There were a lot of agencies, businesses, fashion businesses, sports businesses, who stood and said, we are going to take a stand and ensure we have more black people in our workplace. We treat black people differently. There was a change. So this is not just unique to Kenya, where advertisers or service providers decide to take a stand on an issue in line with their values. And then now, of course, the consequence becomes what you saw with the firing of the presenters.
But Felister, there are those who believe that what the presenters did was just issue advice to women and girls. And those people that believe that are many. And they are their supporters even on social media. So what do you take issue with what they said?
I think for me it's the lack of gender sensitive reporting. And when I talk about gender sensitive reporting, is where you do your coverage with an understanding of gender inequalities, imbalances, and seek to portray both men and women fairly. And reporting, gender sensitive reporting is not just an addition to journalism. It's actually a core principle of journalism, like accuracy and you know, balance and fairness and all that. So for me, I felt there was lack of that because the conversation delved into gender stereotypes around women wanting to be loose or wanting, those are gender stereotypes. They're not factual. And then number two, there was even the environment itself. You know, one of the key things that I feel could have addressed this is if that was a diverse studio, it was 3 men who were discussing, having that conversation. I wonder how it would have turned out if there was a woman who actually would have presented the kind of arguments I've seen women presenting on TV, on social media and on TV and other platforms. How would that conversation have changed? So also the fact that representation in terms of gender was missing, therefore there is just one perspective, and that was the male perspective. And it is problematic because also, as a person who is a gender activist, I was concerned at how the whole issue was handled because I feel there is a pandemic of male entitlement to women's bodies, and that is what we could see there. Men who do not understand consent, the issue of consent, men who maybe have been socialized the way to engage with women sexually, it has to be through coercion, through means of, you know, deceit and all these kind of things, and therefore they brought that conversation to the fore. And that is what I think the public was reacting to, the insensitivity of the framing of that issue. Because, and also when they began to give advice to the young woman and saying, you know, you shouldn't meet strangers. Why are we normalizing that kind of conversation? Meeting strangers shouldn't be something harmful. I have come here at KBC. Some of the people I've met on my way here are strangers. Does that mean that should result in me dying? And then number two, also, this woman was not meeting a stranger. She used social media to meet a person they have been talking about. It is a platform where we usually meet people. It's the whole idea that informed Mark Zuckerberg invention is for him to create networks and people to meet. And we have had a lot of people who have met through relationships on social media. So it was a normal experience that turned out to be horrifying for her because she met with a man who does not understand the word no, who does not understand consent, a man who is entitled to the body of a woman, that if I buy you something, then I'm entitled to sleeping with you. And that is part of the problematic rape culture that we see that is even continuing now on social media.
There's something you talked about, there's a word you mentioned, socialization.
Yeah.
And when you talked about wondering whether, because this was a panel of 3 men, and whether if a woman had been in that conversation, it would have been different. The reality is, even when you look at the comments and the conversations on social media, this conversation whereby it's like the victim is being blamed is also being perpetuated by women.
Yes.
And people forget that the same culture that has socialized men has socialized women as well. So how do we begin to unpack this and say that, you know, this socialization is problematic and it needs to be addressed for men and women as well?
I think the issue is discussing how we have framed sexuality within our society. Sexuality from the side of the woman. Women are not even allowed to acknowledge that they are sexual beings, which is very interesting because when God created us, He put a certain organ in our body that is purely dedicated to sexual pleasure. Nothing, no other function, is just sexual pleasure. But we are not even allowed to admit that we want sex or we are sexual beings. And then on the other side, men have been socialized a certain way when it comes to women. There is a certain entitlement that for me to get to sleep with you, I have to buy you something. So there is a sense of transaction. And then men also now feel entitled that if I bought you something, then now you need to repay me with
and if
that.
you accept the gift,
Yes.
you're also accepting.
You're accepting the terms.
Yes.
This is what we even saw with Ivy, the more university student, where a young man felt so entitled to her time, her conversation and everything, because he had sent her money for birthday and took a matatu all the way to Eldoret and hacked Ivy to death. It is a socialization that we need to unpack about sexuality and what really interactions of sexual nature between men and women should be. And I think rape and sexual violence in a way is very telling of this socialization. How we have framed sex within the society, and of course we have made it something of a power dynamic, something that defines masculinity. So your ability to get it's either heightens you as a man or lowers you as a man. So I imagine in the case of this young man who threw the young lady down
from the 12th
floor. I think it is an interpretation that if a woman says no to you, then you are less of a man and you've already made this investment, in quotes, I'm putting that in quotes, and therefore now this woman should respond to me according to that investment. So I think we need to reshape completely how we interact with each other in matters sexuality, and even have conversations openly about sex and frame each of the genders differently. Women are sexual beings, and I find it very interesting when one of the presenters said that women are loose. I've come to find that when a lot of people say a woman is loose, what they mean is that they are not able to handle a woman who has sexual agency. And so to them, a woman who has sexual agency is a loose woman. And that still goes back to socialization that I'm talking about.
Let's talk about gender issues being confused with female issues. So that if you wade into such a conversation, you're called a beta feminist. You can't just be a feminist. You're beta before you're a feminist. I mean, what's the difference between feminism and addressing gender issues?
I think the idea of feminism has been poorly documented and being told within the African context. Because even for me, a person who defines myself as a feminist, when I meet people and I tell them I am a feminist, their understanding of that is, oh, you're angry, you must be the women who burn their bras and all that. However, within the African setting, feminism has existed, and there are ways of organizing within the African feminist system. We saw it even during pre-colonial time. We saw it during the fight for independence. We have our own Wangari Maathai, who has been an activist for human rights in so many issues. So this idea that if you are a feminist, you are out to, attack men is very wrong. Feminism is the idea of fighting for equality of men and women. And this is in terms of opportunities, social, political, and economical opportunities.
Another thing that came out of this is that first when they were suspended, they had been subjected to undergo training on gender-sensitive reporting. And of course now this has been extended to I believe the entire company, that they will presenters will undergo this training. My issue was, should this come as a form of punishment? Where do we begin with gender-sensitive reporting training? Before or after, as a reaction?
It is at the core, like I said, of journalism. It's not an addition that we are adding to our journalism principles. Gender-sensitive reporting is part of journalism. So if you have journalists who have not been trained on gender responsive reporting, then what exactly are you doing? So I don't think it's something that should be coming up when such incidences happen. It's something that journalists should be prepared to. And even when I took my journalism studies at the University of Nairobi, I went through a session on gender sensitive reporting. So I think it shouldn't be reactive. It should be something we ingrain and enforce throughout the coverage of stories in the country. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Felister, for your time on the big conversation. Like I said, this is a continuous conversation, so we'll carry on with these conversations. Felister Gitonga, Program Officer and Harmful Practices Equality Now, and also trained journalist.